Thank you so much for joining everyone, and for Miku for having read that beautiful quotation, which is very related to our theme at Gems from the Wisdom Traditions today, that theme being creativity and responsibility. Thinking through the different practices that I knew of, traditions that I knew of that are currently in practice, and the people who are creative artists, the person who most came to mind to me to give us a little presentation on this topic is our Kumu Hula at Still a Moving Center, Mālia Helelā. A Kumu Hula is a traditionally trained hula teacher. She is also traditionally trained in Oli, which is Hawaiian chanting, and in Hawaiian massage called Lomi Lomi. She has been a Kumu Hula for 19 years, just celebrated her anniversary this week, at what she calls the ridiculously young age of 23, when she first graduated her unikita as a Kumu Hula. She has delighted many of us with her original creations in both hula and in Oli chanting. And she does that with a great deal of responsibility in alignment with her Hawaiian tradition. So I want to give the floor to Mālia to tell us a little bit more about that.
Aloha mai kākou. O ke au I ka huli vela ka honua, o ke au I ka huli lole kalani, o ke au I ku ka iaka kalai o mālama I ka mālama, o ke au o makali I ka pō, vale o kumu honua ia, o ke kumu o kalipo I lipo ai, o ke kumu o kupo I kowai, o kalipo lipo, kalipo lipo, kalipo kala, kalipo kapo, o vale I hanau kapo, hanau kumulipo I kapo he kane, hanau po ele kapo he wahine. Aloha mai kākou. This is the Kumulipo, which is just one very small part of a much longer creation chant. I want to share with you a quote by a Kumu Hula named Pualani Kanakaole, and she shares that the Kumulipo is the reality of our dim past, the foundation for our future, or for our present, and the pathway into the future. It is a cognizant reminder of our ancestors, their intelligence, failure, defeat, and conquest. This chant is a gift which encourages the warrior within us to awake to the contests and the challenges that continue to confront us today by using ancestral intelligence and experiences with our own intelligence. It is the genealogy that connects the native Hawaiian to land, to sky, and the ocean. I think that when I first thought about the title of our theme for the week, creation and responsibility, I thought of creation. I thought of the Kumulipo, which is the Hawaiian creation chant. It is the source of light from within the darkness. And when I read the quote by Pualani Kanakaole, talking about the past, the present, and the future, it really helped me to frame how I wanted to present my talk today. When I think of origins and kuleana, which is responsibility, I do think of just how do we know where we are today. It's only in relation to the past. We orient ourselves all the time, who we are because of who our family is, who we are because of the work that we do. You know, we align and orient ourselves in so many different ways. And the Kumulipo, as one of the earliest chants of creation, it really helps to give us a foundation. I know what it's like to feel like I am a point in darkness and to find that point and grow light and to create life. I think is a universal calling to each and every one of us from whichever culture and background that we have. how can we cultivate light and knowledge and understanding. So let me share one book that has been very, very important to me. So this is a book called Nā Pule Kahiko, which is a collection of prayers by June Gutmanis. Many of the chants that I learned from Kumujan Keola Lake, I have found in this book. And there's one chant that I never learned, but it just really captured me. And it's a prayer that I found within this book, and I will show you the original. He pule no kela ame keiala, a daily prayer. And this came at the very end of a chapter on prayers for blessing your house. And so we have this idea that prayers don't just stop when we dedicate the home, but they continue, and they should continue on a daily basis. And so here is an example of a daily house prayer. And so I'll just read through one line at a time. Eo umau kia'i mai kapo mai. Kia'i are the guardians, mai kapo, from remote antiquity. The first chant that I did, the Kumulipo, is source in Po, so that remote antiquity is reflected in our creation chant. E nana ia mai ka haleo kako, watch over our hale, watch over our home. And then comes a curious list of opposites, of polarities. Mai luna alalo, from the top to the bottom of the house. Mai kahikihia kahikihi, from one corner to the other corner of the house. Mai kahikina ki komohana, from the east to the west. Mai kauka ahekai, from the side of the house that's facing the mountains to the side of the house that's facing to Kai, to the ocean. Mai loko avaho, from inside to outside. And so these pairs are the main thing that I wanted to share. Let me just quickly finish this prayer so that we can come back to this idea of pairs and balance and duality. Kia i'ia, to watch over, malamaia, to be protected. E paleaku, ward off, ina ho'opilikiana, ikoka ko nohona, anything that may trouble our way of life. Amama ua noa. And so when I think about these opposites, this is really something that can help us find our own place. And I was introduced to this idea by a Hawaiian scholar named Kalei Nu'uhiwa. She shared a completely different prayer, but it had these ideas of opposites. And she shared with me that really the point of this prayer is to find our place of alignment from the east to the west, from the zenith to the horizon, from the roots to the tips of the tree. These points of reference help us to find our own true center. And my husband was talking about modern science and classical science, where in order to find our point in the universe, there has to be a reference, that still point, like the still and moving, by which everything moves around. It's that point of reference. And so as I was thinking about this idea of finding our own place and having that center of the universe reside within our own heart, within our own consciousness and understanding, I remembered being on the edge of the ocean so many times when that sun is rising and that path of light is coming directly to me. And each and every one of us, if we were standing on the same shore, if we were all watching the same sunrise, that pathway of light from the sun is going to come to each of us individually. And so this prayer, I think, really reflects this creation and responsibility that we have, the responsibility to create for ourselves a point of reference that we can then move through our life. And so I did not just simply take the chant that I found in this book. I adapted it. And here we have a longer prayer. It's a Pule Mauliola. I adapted this from a prayer for a house into a prayer for balance and well-being. So we have the same beginning. Eo umau kia imai kapo mai, to my guardians from the remote past. E nana ia mai, look down upon us. And rather than watching over our house, I say grant life, grant healing. And then I expanded these pairs so that we can really refine and define our still center. My luna alalo from above to below, my loko avaho from inside to outside, my kahikihi a kahikihi from one corner to the other, my kauka he kai from the mountains to the sea, my kahikina ke komohana from the east to the west, my kaho'okui a kahalavai from the zenith to the horizon, my ke kumu a kavelau from the base of the tree all the way up to the leaf tips, my kala hiki a kala kau from the rising to the setting of the sun. We have a similar ending, kia i'ia, to be guarded by, malamaia, to be cared by, and cared by all of our kia'i, all of our guardians. E palea kuina pilikia, ward off any troubles, trouble of any kind, until we can achieve mauliola, which is balance and well-being. A mama ua noa. And so, as a group, let's take this collective image. Okay, you can place yourself on the shore of your choice. Just imagine that we are all at the ocean, standing in the breeze, watching the waves roll in, and the sun is rising, and there is a path of light that beams from the light directly to our own heart, to our center. And I'm going to do this prayer with the intention that we all find and create for ourselves a point of stillness. E o uma o kia I mai ka po mai e na na ia mai a ho ola. Mai luna lalo mai loko avaho mai kahikihi a kahikihi. Mai ka uka ke kai. Mai ka hikina ke komohana. Mai ka ho'oku ia ka halavai. Mai ke kumua ka velau. Mai ka la hiki a ka la kau. Kia I ia. Malama ia, e palea kuina pilikia hiki mauliola, amama wanoa. And 2 claps to close. So this to me illustrates how in the present, you know, we all have this agency, we all have this ability to orient ourselves in space and create either that still center that we need to stay still, or that point of reference so we know the best way that we have to move forward. Now, the last part I wanted to mention before we go into a discussion is the idea that responsibility sometimes dwells in the future. Creation to me was spurred by the idea of our Kumulipo, our creation chant that comes from the remotest antiquity, the farthest, deepest point of human existence and creation to the present. But I'm also aware that sometimes we have responsibilities that reach forward into the future. It's our actions of today. What are the things that we can choose to do that can have a life beyond us? You know, what responsibility do we have to the future? I mean, simply thinking about the world we're leaving behind for our children, our students, our family, for those future generations. I wanted to share a quick story about when I was training to become a hula teacher. My kumu, she shared with me a story from when she was a very, very young teacher herself. And she had found a book similar to me. I shared with you Napuli Kahiko. Well, she had another book that she had found a beautiful chant, and she taught it to her students. And pretty soon after, they started becoming injured in their legs, specifically in their legs. One was in a bicycle accident, a couple were in a car accident, and these were her top dancers who were getting injured in her legs. Her father, who was still living at the time, time had a very deep understanding of multiple dialects of Hawaiian, and he knew that something wasn't quite right, particularly for dancers to be hurt in their legs. It shows that something actually had been done by the teacher. And I'm not sure if this is a common understanding in Western culture, but amongst Hawaiians, we recognize that as adults, if we make a mistake, if we do something wrong, it's usually the most vulnerable in our families that will take the consequence. And so when my kumu had all of her students manifesting injuries in the legs, her father knew that there was something that needed to just needed to be addressed. And so he asked, "What have you been doing, Pulu? Like, what are you teaching?" And she said, look at this chant. I found it. It's beautiful. It's about flowers in the forest." And he looked at it and said, "Pulu, you're offering your dancers as sacrifices." She didn't know what she was actually doing because she just didn't have that context. And so from that moment, she impressed upon me the importance of creating my own chants, of creating compositions and choreography of my own, because then I would know exactly what was in these different chants. And that is the reason that I took this beautiful chant that I found and I switched it around. I changed the focus, I changed the order, just to create a clear understanding for myself. Particularly as a teacher, sharing this with my students and encouraging my students to chant this, it becomes a responsibility of me as a teacher to look toward the future and see what are the things that I'm creating, how may they have an impact in the future. And so there was a time right when I was becoming Kumu Hula where I was supposed to be going to Kauai to gather Mālia for our Merry Monarch performance, and I overslept. I had my backpack on, I had my clothes, I had my phone on my chest, and I thought, I'm just gonna lay down for a minute and set my alarm, and then I'll drive to the airport. Next thing I know, I woke up and the sun was shining, the birds were chirping, I had so many missed calls on my phone, I missed the flight. Everybody who had gone were already in the mountains. I couldn't even catch a flight to meet them. I lost that opportunity. And I was feeling so dejected. I felt so bad. At the time I was living in Nu'uanu, and so I drove down to Mauna Ala, which is the Royal Mausoleum. It is where Lili'uo Kalani, Kalakaua, Bernice Pauahi Bishop, and many ali'i, many monarchs are laid to rest. And so I went and I walked down the stairs and I literally sat on the ground and I cried because I felt like, how could I have missed this opportunity? But I felt so humbled in that moment. A song started to lift up in my heart. And it's a song that talked about being a kahumalama, which is a caretaker. And as a caretaker, as a caretaker, I actually thought that this name Kahumalama was a drum that I was going to find on the island of Kauai later. So I ended up going to Kauai with my father, and I had this idea. I'm going to go to this sacred area on Kauai. I'm going to find a stump of coconut to make a drum. And I'm going to bring it back to Oahu, and that's going to be my drum, Kahumalama. Well, we went to Kauai, we drove around, we went to this very sacred place, and I'm looking around and I didn't see any coconut stumps. I really thought I was called to find this, this wood to create my drum. And right as I was about to leave, I noticed that there was an empty signpost. And off against a shed was a sign, and it was essentially the sign that says, "This is a sacred area. Please do not remove anything from the area. This is a sacred place, so treat it with respect." And as I picked it up and I set it against that empty post where it belonged, it just struck me right to my core that how can I even think about going to take something away from this place? I'm the caretaker. It's not this drum that I want to find that's named Kahumalama. I need to be that Kahumalama. And so the final line in this song says, "Nama ko ke kuliana." It is up to us. It is our responsibility, e liloina kahu, to become the caretakers, I malamaia, that are the ones who will take care of others. And so I wanted to close my presentation with the song that to me speaks toward the future. It is having that sense of responsibility and curatorship of being a caretaker for things reaching into the future. And so this song is Kahu Malama. And you'll hear me say Auhea Oi, which is where are you? Kahu Malama. E mau tupina ino ma ko e ho hano hano hala kula kahu malama au hea oe kahu malama au hea oe nama ko ke kuliana e liloina kahui malama ia kulia maue o lai ke au o a mana me ka mahalono nama ko ke kuliana e liloina kahui malama ia kulia maue o lai ke au o a mana me ka mahalono kahu malama. So this song calls each of us to become caretakers of, I believe, caretakers of things from the past, caretakers of our present moment and the direction and choices that we make, and also caretakers of the future. So mahalo nui, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Oh, that was just perfect. Thank you, Malia. Wow. May I ask the first question? Given that the rest of us may not feel as much like creatives as we see you being, we may not be inventing our own hula, our own chants, and so on. How do you see us as being able to apply the same principle toward our own creativity and responsibility?
That's a really good question. I think awareness really builds some kind of momentum, right? Being aware of what it is that we are responsible for can help to inform us into what choice to make, you know, what thing to act on. And this really makes me think of in Hawaii in the 1860s. This was often referred to in modern days as the population bottleneck. we lost 9 out of 10 Hawaiians. So we had this great population that narrowed down to just a few thousands of people. And then now, as more people are having part Hawaiian babies, we have a much wider population now. But at the time, it was widely understood that stories were being lost. You know, it was widely understood that amongst a wide range of occupations and of knowledge bases, that not just the hula people were losing their elders and their teachers, but the carvers, the fishermen, the farmers, you know, a wide portion of the population was acknowledged that they were being lost. And so I feel that at every stage of history, there have been people trying to create archives, to gather stories and to share stories. Even modern day, I know people who are actively seeking out elders to talk story, because my great-grandma, my tutu, was a native Hawaiian speaker. She passed away when I was an intermediate. I never heard her speak Hawaiian. I never sought to speak Hawaiian with her, because I was kind of embarrassed. But now I just wish I had taken that time to connect with her more. And so I feel that with this pandemic, I feel like we are all a little bit more aware of how tenuous life is, and to really, in our own fields, in our own practices, to really seek out any connections we have, both to members in our family that may have done, you know, maybe a member of our family was a painter. We may be able to find some old artwork to just give us an idea for today. But yeah, I think that if we can just have a sense that we have a genealogy back and that we can find a point of connection to move forward. The big answer, I'm not sure if that answered you.
In part, I know that you're talking about looking to the past in order to create into the future responsibly. That's what I understand. I imagine there are other people with questions and ideas of their own. Doris?
I think the one teaching that I've received from you that is reflected in today's topic of creativity and responsibility is the fact of when we make a lei, and if we get flowers from our neighbors' yards, to please be sure to ask permission first and not just go and sneak and take flowers. Otherwise, just your lei might come apart during the performance or whatever. So when I heard this topic, I thought, oh, that story.
Thank you. And beyond that too, the idea that when we create a lei, all the little leaves that we don't use, all the stems that we break off, I was taught to never put that in the trash. Like to gather up all of those small little pieces and put it back into the earth so that it can return. Yeah, but thank you for that, Doris. Yeah, lei making is a perfect metaphor because you know we're gathering. We have to be mindful and responsible as we gather, and not just for what we create with our lei, but what do we do with all the trash, all the extras? We don't just throw it away. We put it back into the earth. Yeah, mahalo nui.
And so also whenever I guess my new habit since being a student of yours, I do now when I pick tea leaves or pick something from my own yard, I do ask permission of the plant as I'm taking it. So that's another thing that you've instilled in me. So thank you for that.
Oh, mahalo nui. And thank you for also bringing up the idea of asking permission. I don't know what it's like for all of you in your upbringing, you know, if it was important to ask permission, even before picking a flower, you know, it's good to ask permission of the, you know, whoever's taking care of the plant, but even of the plant, like, is it okay? Like, I'd like to put you in my hair. Is it okay if I pick you? You know, is something that I think lets us know that it's not just us in the world, that there is something beyond us. There's, I think, a humility of understanding that I am only one part of this wider creation. And so, yeah, I think that can be really helpful. Thank you, Doris. Cliff, aloha.
Thank you so much. That was such a joy to listen to. I was thinking in the last two GEM conversations that the theme of deep listening was a part of the last two, and you kind of hinted at that too. This ability to have a deeper level of listening. And I was thinking the early Hawaiians were great navigators at sea, and one great canoe steersman, Nappy Napoleon, taught me that to know how to navigate forward, you have to keep looking back, especially if there's a landmass, to keep yourself aligned. But then, of course, they were great readers of the stars as well. But in this idea of creativity and responsibility, I'm thinking a little bit of Thoreau, where he says it's one thing to be an artist, but it's another thing to be able to carve the very atmosphere in which we live. This idea of sensitivity, to nature and to everything around us. That's one thing that the great navigators had. They could sense everything in the ocean, the birds, the currents, even the water backing off of an island. It says that they could sense water reflecting off of a landmass for hundreds of miles at sea. They were incredibly, incredibly sensitive in the present. And I was wondering what your thoughts are, what we could learn from Hawaiian culture about it being more sensitive, deep sensitivity to nature and to each other.
That is fantastic. I love that quote that you shared. Thank you so much. And that's a really big question. That's a really big question. I think that coming into one of the early prayers that I shared, the prayer that allows us to find our orientation, that's a really important thing. When we can know our place in the world and recognize how we interact with other things, whether it's people, whether it's the ocean or the islands or even the very air around us, then that is part of the deep listening, that you mentioned. I think having that sensitivity is something I think about so often with my kids. I have children who are teenagers now, and I feel like there is so much information coming in constantly. And there are medical studies about how much information we take in through computers and phones and tablets. And we have access to, the great works of writing around the world with just the click of a few keystrokes. And so I think what is really a valuable thing to know is how to filter through all of the information that's coming at us in order to find what is the best and most balanced way to move forward, both for me and those around me. And you mentioned voyaging. I would think that a navigator sailing into a storm can't even see the stars to orient himself. Can't tell a current because the waves are so big. There's so much information coming in. How does that navigator filter through all of the extra to find what he needs to bring his group to safety? And so I think that you hit it squarely on the head when you said deep listening. I think it's being aware of what is moving around us so that we can filter through and figure out, okay, based on all of these understandings, like what is it that we can pull forward to help us make our decision? And those, I don't know if modern people today have more stimulus coming in, more insight, more information coming in. We have a lot of things coming in through TVs and computers, but I think the ancient people had more sensory input into the environment. I don't think it's a new thing for humans to have to filter through a lot of information coming in. And so I think if we can take that deep listen, and I'm going to ask you again for that quote, to carve the air around you. That's gorgeous.
I'll text it to you.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could put it in the chat for everybody, would be great.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'd like to quick share with everyone the definition of responsibility. I'm just going to share that real quick. So this is a really great online resource. It's called vehevehe.org. It's an online Hawaiian dictionary. And so I had looked up kuleana, which is responsibility. And the first 4 words really kind of capture it for me. It's a right, a privilege, a concern, and a responsibility. So there's a lot after that about business and real estate, because when Hawaii became, when land ownership was introduced to Hawaii, it was, it required a lot of thought. It was not a natural way of thinking about caretaking the land. But this idea of having a privilege that is also a responsibility, I think is really important. You know, I think that there's this idea that a responsibility is so heavy, like we have to be so responsible, when really so much of our, so much of what we have as responsibilities really are privileges. Like, I get to raise my kids. How privileged am I? You know, I get to stand up on my own 2 feet and dance. How privileged am I? That responsibility, it can be a blessing, it can be such a blessing as well.
I was looking at responsibility from the Oxford Dictionary, and one of the definitions is the ability or opportunity to act and make decisions without authorization. So if you have the responsibility, you have the authority. It is your right and your privilege to be the authority on that. You got me to thinking, maybe completely off topic, but interestingly enough, in looking at center, right, it's easy to find this center because it's right in the middle between our hands. But I thought, well, what about top to bottom? So while you were doing the chant, I went and, so I'm 66 inches tall. And it turns out that 33 inches is right to the pubic bone. And then I divided this top half. And sure enough, the halfway point is right there at the sternum. Just interesting, our architecture in that way. But this being the center, right? The heart being the center right between this creation and this creation. Yeah, creativity and creativity, you know, at the root. Maybe completely off topic, but it was somewhere my mind wandered to.
Oh, that's brilliant, David. That's really brilliant. So I'm just curious, show of hands, is anybody familiar with the term or the word pico? Do we know pico? So many know pico as your belly button. Yeah, so your pico is your belly button. But a pico is a very important point of energy, and most people acknowledge 3 pico. And so right at the top of the head, the soft spot on a baby, that's your fontanel. Even though the bones close as we get older, that still remains like a spiritual connection. It's an opening. It's an opening. And so there's the pico on the top of our head that connects us to the divine. There is our belly button, our pico, that connects us by the umbilical cord to our mother. So that connects us to our genealogy. And then the other pico is our reproductive organs, and that connects us to the future. You know, that is our future creations. That is the 3rd pico that is mainly acknowledged. There's a 4th one that not a lot of people are aware of, and that's at the bottom of the feet. And some believe that that's where our spirit travels. When we dream, our spirit will travel and go to the future and the past, and our spirit has free reign through the bottoms of the feet. And so I think when we look at our own body and finding that point of center is really interesting. I'm so glad you did that.
There was something I ran across recently, and this to me relates to the idea of chanting and prayer and mantra, particularly the repetition of prayer. when we enter a prayer or do a mantra or some practice, we cultivate a state of awareness, a mental state, you might say. And what they've shown through brain scans is that with repetition, those things that become states actually become traits. They actually change the physical structure of our brain. In particular, this area in the very center of the prefrontal cortex, which is where the brain functions for what they refer to as resonance, our ability to connect to each other. And this is a problem in autism, right? Is that area is underdeveloped and they don't have that ability to connect and read into one another. And it's interesting how the very act of that repetition through moving awareness actually develops this center of the brain. It gets stronger, and hence our ability then to connect, to each other. Some might refer to it as telepathy, and this connection to each other.
I was reading a really interesting article recently about just extra senses that have been recognized in humans. So we have, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. But there are other things that we can sense, like a change in temperature, right? We can feel a fever with our hand off the head. Some people have a certain amount of metals in their face and their nose that allow them to sense direction, similar to animals like birds migrating. Animals migrating, there's a sense of being able to find direction. So many different senses beyond what we know that are measurable. And so I feel very humbled to this idea that, there's so much, we have the ability to create so many things and to find our way in so many different ways. So,
I just got the connection because when you had the slide up that showed the prayer, it said that you don't just do it once when you move in, you do it on a daily basis, right? And so that's the repetition. And so what the studies I was reading about is this notion of moving awareness. When we do a body scan, we feel our feet. So as you're moving this awareness left, right, up, down, top to bottom, this is moving awareness. And it's that moving of awareness that is developing that little part of the brain.
Oh, mahalo nui, David. So I'm seeing in the chat from Carol, thank you so much for including that, about the heart also has a patent place that is open until a baby takes its first breath and causes that opening to close within moments of the first breath, called the foramen oval, meaning an opening within the heart that is patent and open while in the womb. It only closes when we're physically separated from the mother. That is really fascinating. It feels like a rite of passage. It feels like a very deep and biological rite of passage. Something within the heart that changes with the breath. Thank you, Carol. That's fantastic.
It seems as though anytime we think of giving birth, there's so much of a clear reference to creation and responsibility. That bringing of another human being into the world, oh my gosh. And as you say, a privilege as well.
Well, I feel like I spoke about so many things. I don't know if anybody has a question for me about creativity, whether it's prayers or hula. I just find it really heartening to think back to ancestors that kind of struggled with these same things, to create, to shoulder their responsibilities. It heartens me to think that I'm not the only one. I'm really fortunate because I have my mom here with me today. And so grateful to her. I'll tell you a short story. When I was a little girl, my mom didn't actually dance hula for a while when I was dancing. She danced when she was a little girl, but she was the backstage mom. She was the backstage mother, and we would usually be the last family to leave a show. You know, all the dancers would come, would put on our tea leaf skirts, put on all of our leis, do all the costume changes, do the performance, pack up and go. And we usually were always the last ones to go because we were there picking up all of the fallen flowers, we're cleaning it up with this idea that we want to leave the space better than how we found it. And so thank you, Mom, for just helping to instill. And again, David, it's that repetition. We didn't just do this one time. You know, we were the ones. And so that instilled very deeply this sense of responsibility, yeah, not just to myself, but to leaving the space even better than how we found it.
Mālia, I have a question to ask you. As I'm looking here, I see that Raina's here, and I know many of us were fortunate enough to see you give Raina her hula name. And I'm just thinking about how the bestowing of a name, I mean, it is this creative process that you have to go through to think of the right name. And also just the incredible responsibility to name someone, to gift someone with a name that they will carry with them. And I just wonder if you might say a few words about that process of creating that name, and also how it feels for you to gift a name. And maybe does it feel different to you now that you've gifted many names from like the first time you gave someone a name?
Thank you so much for the question. So having a hula name is something, again, I was raised up in hula. We'd have new students come in, and if they didn't have a Hawaiian name, my kumu would give them their hula name, a Hawaiian name. And I don't know what the first, I feel like my children were I guess it was students that I first started giving names to. And it feels like such a privilege. I would say it's more on the privilege end than the responsibility. Because in Hawaiian thinking, your name connects you. You know, your name is something that should ground you and give you inspiration. It should have some sense of guidance to it. And so to me, it's always been such a pleasure to find just the right name for people. And I'm the kind of person, I read the dictionary for fun. I love thesauruses. I love to read the thesaurus just to see how one thought can be expressed in so many different ways. It's really fascinating. And there's a whole wide range of when the twins, when I had my twins, it took us several months to find their names. It took a long time. We had the Department of Health saying, you better let us know, like submit your birth certificates, because we just wanted to find the right balance, both individually, but also between the twins. You know, so one of them is ho'oku'i, the other is halavai, because one twin was vertex and the other was breach, or transverse and then breach. So finding that perfect match, I think, is such a responsibility. And it's interesting how sometimes a name will come like that. Like Doris, I was actually looking completely for something different. And the moment I saw aukahi, actually I saw the word aukahi, I'm like, that's it. And then it said, my brain said, ke aloha, aukahi ke aloha. You know, it was just in a moment, I just knew. Versus other names, I have one that I've still been pondering for a very long time. There's this idea in Hawaiian culture of an inoa po. It's a name that comes through a dream. And I don't know that I've had that experience, but I know people who have, where they have an ancestor or somebody appear to them in a dream and say, this will be the name for this child that is coming. A friend of mine actually, who just gave birth, I would say, I think the baby's 1. It was exactly like that for her. She had a dream that said, your baby's name will be this. And she knew it in her heart from that moment. Her baby was always that name. And so it also gives us the opportunity to honor ancestors, you know, so to bring life back to somebody who's gone before, you know, to bring life to their memory, to speak their name again. You know, so that's a really wonderful part of naming, is having that connection to somebody in the past.
And this notion of naming and language itself Like you, I'm also a bit of a nut on, and so we find that there's a direct correlation between one's vocabulary and intelligence, because we think in language. And one of my favorite teachers, whose name is Terence Mckenna, just as recent as last night, I was watching one of his videos, and so I just found the quote, the part of it that's relevant here. He's a cultural anthropologist, specifically investigating the evolution of human consciousness as we evolve. He says we can move no faster than the evolution of our language. And it goes on making some references to how that happens in our culture. But absolutely, there's a responsibility in giving something a name, because it, like you said, it changes the way you think, and the way you think changes your behavior. And there's a responsibility as a result, the laws of karma. Our language and our names are driving the results.
Yeah, language is such a big responsibility. You would think that I would have led with this with my talk, but there is I would say, a very well-known Hawaiian proverb that says, "Ika olelo no keola, ika olelo no kamake." So within the language, there is life, and within the language, there is death. The idea that literally life and death are contained within our words. And when you see a lot of the Hawaiian scholars writing and trying to transmit all kinds of different knowledge and insights, the Hawaiian language newspapers didn't have all of the diacriticals. It didn't have all of the okina or the kahako, the macrons that we use in modern spelling, modern spelling of Hawaiian. And it's like there was enough context, the readers knew enough that they could figure out the meaning of a word without having, the diacritical markings. And there are some educators today that don't like to use the diacriticals because they feel like it defines the word too narrowly. That there are words that have many possible meanings, and that if you mark it, you define it too tightly, then you lose the nuance. And so I find myself in this constant wondering, how much to name and define something and how much to allow it free expression. Yeah, but language, it's so important. In terms of Hawaiian being an oral culture, we had nothing written down. There are petroglyphs, so those are images carved into stone. But in terms of like an alphabet and a system of writing, we didn't have anything like that until the American missionaries came. And so, yeah, how can we use our language? How can we use our language to express? It is a huge responsibility. Yeah, it is a very big responsibility. Mm-hmm.
The word abracadabra literally translates to, I create as I speak.
Yeah, that's really neat. I love that. I create as I speak. Yeah, I believe that. I see another note in the chat from Sheila about looking back to ancestors and their creativity for our own inspiration. When I was first studying Lomi Lomi massage, I used to wish I had a healer in my line, like somebody that could validate me. Like I descend from a lineage of healers. Like I really wanted to find somebody in my line. And I don't know, I didn't for the longest time. And then one day my mom casually said, "Oh, your grandpa used to massage me. This is how he massaged me. It's how I'm massaging you." And I thought, oh, I have a lineage. My mom massaged me, her father massaged him. But it wasn't until I'd say maybe about 8 or 9 years ago when I started studying under my current Lomi teacher. And he said, all of us carry our ancestors with us. And if we look at what inspires us, what is our work, like what is it that we do, then that is a very clear marker of what our ancestors have done in the past. And so people who care for animals or people who record things and collect stories. In terms of our Lomi class, you said just by you being here and studying Lomi Lomi, that tells me that someone in your line, somebody in your lineage also did this work. And that was like decades later, this validation, this idea that, that we descend from a lineage and our ancestors are with us. We see that in DNA, we carry our ancestors with us. And what's gonna pop up as a trait? Do I have, brown hair, or do I, have a way with words? I think it's a really inspiring thing to think back to our ancestors and find inspiration from them. So that's so exciting, Sheila, that you have special items from your family.
Is there anybody who would like to give other examples that you've had in your life of finding how something that you created made an impact, an important impact on someone else? So you really realized how responsible you were for your creations. It's okay to be brave.
I don't know if this is creation or not, but when I first moved here, and I was telling somebody I used to work with computers, he said, well, could you teach some Micronesian women how to use a computer? And I said, well, sure, I can try. And so there were 15 Micronesian women at Kroc Center, and when I first went around the room and asked each of them what they wanted to learn, they said, computer. And so we started they had laptops the Kroc Center supplied. We started with learning where the button was to turn on the computer. So it was gratifying to see how they progressed, and they needed to learn how to fill out I-94 forms and job applications online. So that was really the purpose for them, to learn how to use a computer. So yeah, that was very gratifying.
Did you want to mention something?
Something happened last night that has happened often to me. Someone came to our house as a guest of someone else, and she said, "Oh, you're a storyteller." I have told stories in schools and so on for many years, and it often happens. Even adults, will stop me on BART or something and say, "Oh, you're," and so, and they always express it, how much that meant to them. So that's a very nice thing. I like when that happens.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I think that's maybe possibly, Renee, a way to wrap. Is that okay?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
so I think that storytelling is probably the ultimate creative responsibility. When we think about the parables and, teaching stories that come down, it shares knowledge in so many different forms. And so the last thing I was hoping to share today is the first chant that I did, the Kumulipo, the Hawaiian chant of creation, was recorded as a song by the Makaha Sons of Ni'ihau, I want to say in the 80s, maybe the early 90s. And it was really controversial because here is an ancient sacred chant that was set to modern music. And so there was this debate about, is that really bad? Is that disrespecting the chant? Or is the chant gaining new life because the words are being sung now? And I like to think that, and I'm getting chicken skin to support it, that as we share stories in different ways, there is that responsibility to share inspiration and knowledge and insight. And yet we do have untold creativity in how we share those stories. So I'm going to pull up one last time. These are the lyrics to the Kumulipo, but this time I'm going to sing it. So this is by, it was actually I think this was the intro to one of their songs, but it goes like this. O kea wi ka huli vela ka honua, o kea wi ka huli lole ka lani, kea wi ku ka ia ka kala, e ho o malama lama I ka malama, kea ho makali I ka po, o ka vale vale ho o kumu honua, ke kumu o ka lipo I lipo ai, o ke kumu o ka po I po ai. O ka lipo lipo, o ka lipo lipo, o ka lipo ka la, o ka lipo ka po, po vale ho I hanau ka po. Anau kumulipo I ka po he kane, anau po ele I ka po he wahine. Amama wanoa. And 2 claps to close.
Oh, Maria, that was a perfect ending. Our session last week of Gems from the Wisdom Tradition was on rediscovering America. And the collective notion that we came to was that we can rediscover America, which has much broader roots than we may have been taught originally in school, is by looking to the stories of all the different people who make up this country and really listening to all those stories. And that is the true way to rediscover it. So you've made a perfect tie-in between last week and this. And we have so much to thank Mālia for. Everybody, thank you so much for attending. And Mālia, that was wonderful.
So mahalo nui. Thank you so much, everybody.